Hi, welcome. My name is Alex Baca. I'm the DC Policy Director at Greater Washington. I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. This is a sort of very general discussion about the DC budget. Back in February, I had hosted a training on how to testify for oversight hearings in front of the DC Council. I will be totally honest, I am a lot more comfortable with oversight and the sort of attendant like ways that works. Budget, though, is like a really core part of the DC government. Obviously, we're going to talk about that. We had some demand for a budget training, so I wanted to present that. So, thank you so much for being here. We'll learn together. No, just kidding. I do know some stuff about this. Obviously, it's part of my job. So what I am going to spend most of this evening on, unlike our oversight testimony training, if you had joined us for that or watched the recording, that was a lot of like how to testify. Because that hearing is recorded, the slide deck is out there and I can recirculate that after this. Much of the stuff that applies there, like also applies here in terms of how to testify, how to sign up, how to find information on that. I'm not going to talk too much about that tonight, and that's by design. I just want to give you more of an overview of like how in the course of my job, I look at the budget and try to understand some of the information in it. If you are interested in testifying, like I will answer questions. I'm happy to help you. I'm happy to review anything that you are writing. Just let me know what you need. So I did want to just point out that this is like less about organizing people to testify or telling you how to testify and more about what to do when you look at the gigantic PDF that is the district budget. So thank you for being here. For those of you who aren't super familiar with us, Greater Washington works on land use, housing, and transportation. There are two sides to our organization. We have our publication team, which manages GGWash.org, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and we so appreciate your readership. Our publication team is amazing. They assign, write, and edit content on the site. There is a pretty distinct firewall between the site and our policy team, which is myself, Caitlin Rager, our deputy director, and Ron Thompson, our policy officer. We work to enable more housing, more affordable housing, frequent and reliable transportation, and the fair share of land uses in the district. That's where we're at right now. We are growing. Things are changing around here. So if you receive organizational updates from us, we hope that you'll be along for the ride as we fundraise and bring on more staff in the future. This event is, and I say this and most things that I do, it's not about getting you to say the same thing as us, not during the budget season and not ever. When we do that, we'll let you know. It'll be very clear that we're making a distinct task of you to participate in the talking points that we're providing, but that's not what this is. So this is more about how I look at the mayor's budget when it comes out in preparation for the council's budget hearing. So I have a presentation. I'm going to give the presentation, probably go until 6:30, 6:35. Then we can just chat, discuss stuff. I need to hop off around 7:15. This is set up as a Zoom call, not as a webinar. That's by design. I prefer to have open discussions if I can. Please keep yourself on mute. But do feel free to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A as I'm talking. If I can, I'll get to them. If not, we'll get to them at the end. This is being recorded. We're going to post it on ggwash.org. Usually the recording is just my face and the slide deck. But just as a heads up, we will send a follow-up email to attendees ambitiously by the end of this week, but more realistically by next week. So resources will be available to you. Everything that I include in here, I will share. So basics. I'm going to start. I had a bizarre dream last night. I thought I canceled this. And I woke up thinking that I had like completely canceled this whole thing. And I had to rebuild this slide deck from scratch. That was a good opportunity to sort of reboot a sort of half-assembled slide deck that didn't make a ton of sense. So you're getting some really basic information that I hope is appropriate. So who does the DC budget? The mayor does the DC budget. The budget comes from the mayor. October through mid-March, the administration is putting together the budget. It is the mayor's budget. They're living in it. When it comes out, it says Mayor Muriel Bowser on it. It'll say the mayor's name under any mayor because it's their budget. Then it goes to the council. We'll skip down to the third bullet point. There's a little gap where we're in we are in the budget together with the council, where people show up to hearings, they testify, council members are asking government witnesses questions about things. And then that very quickly after those April hearings, it becomes really the chairman's budget. That's kind of the big duty of the council chairman, who is the chair of the council of the whole, like the whole council. And it really, there's a lot of resources devoted to his office to get this moving, because that's, the committee that he chairs, and that's the leadership point for that. So we're, in this little mid-March gap right now where there is like all the public testimony before this really kind of goes from the mayor to the chairman to like what actually comes out and gets voted on by the full council. What it is, there's two things here. There's the like local budget act of the year, that is the numbers. So we're going to look at the numbers that passes in a piece of legislation. It's the local budget act. Then there's something called the Budget Support Act. If you are paying attention to sort of the news cycles and stuff around that, and I recognize some of the names on this call, and I know you guys are reading local news and you're paying attention to stuff. A lot of times like things happen in the budget that are not just the numbers, and that is typically done through the Budget Support Act. So if you are thinking about this, in my brain goes, no, that's what I call policy every time I read the BSA, because it's not a number. So, typically if you're modifying an existing program or creating a new program, there is accompanying legislation in the BSA. Numbers only implement themselves if like something that already exists is just being carried out in its current form. So there's two pieces of this. And I think that's one of the reasons that, aside from the fact that budgets are critical to local government, any government, that there tends to be a lot of news around the budget cycle, because council members are often also trying to do things through the Budget Support Act. So it's more than just the numbers. There's a lot of policy happening at the same time. Obviously budgets are policy, so just something to look out for with that. The council budget schedule is here. It's linked here. We'll send you the link so you can see the list of hearings. You can also check the DC council calendar, but the broader schedule of the sort of process here, we're in this highlighted part right now. Our council budget hearings have started. They begin on Monday. They go through April 7th. Mayor's budget came out last week. There's some briefings for the committee of the whole. And it goes through sort of a similar process to other legislation where it's, there are hearings, there's a committee hearing, there's markups. The budget work session is typically where the council is meeting to talk through all of this stuff. And then, there's some hearings, and then there's a final vote. I don't think that is scheduled yet in case there needs to be delays with that. Don't stress too much about these dates. It is just to give you a sense of like where we are in space with how this works. The most important thing to know is this is really, the mayor's budget is usually out in mid-March. Hearings go through like late March to early April, and then like this will pass in May after a whole lot of back and forth. So where in space is this happening? Like I said, this comes from the administration. The budget starts in the administration. I think that's something to really remember. So when you're looking at the mayor's budget, it is the mayor's budget. It's coming from her departments, and people are talking, or the people who are working on it from that side are kind of, furthering like the administration's agenda. That's normal. We have two branches of government in DC. So that's, that formulation sort of starts in October. If you are ever talking to departments, on the early side, they are working on stuff and have the budget in mind, as early as that, if not earlier, since so much of this stuff is on just like a one-year cycle. It comes out in March. Again, it's the mayor's budget. Once the budget kind of lands at the council, these hearings begin late March, they're underway. And what happens is that like council members and their staff are usually putting together like the list of things that they want to fund that the mayor didn't fund, because there's always going to be stuff that the mayor didn't fund, even with a really large budget. There's a lot of stuff everybody wants to do, which is great. So typically, council offices will find as much as they can within their own committee agencies. We'll talk about committees in a little bit, and then sort of fund as much as they can. So there's a little bit of back and forth, and sometimes there's some horse trading with other offices. It's a lot of complicated back and forth. Most of the public is not going to see that, and that's okay. Like it's hard to keep up with, and sometimes it doesn't totally have a huge bearing on the outcome. So don't stress too much about that. I think what's important to know is that there's a lot of stuff that's going on behind the scenes to try to find money for stuff. Another thing to note here is that like when the budget comes from the mayor's office, a lot of it is pretty fully baked. Like there's just a lot of stuff that like we're not gonna shift money around from. That could be major capital expenditures, that could be sort of existing like personnel stuff. So you like council offices will nudge in sort of like more or fewer employees, or different allocations toward programmatic stuff, but there's probably not going to be like a big like shakeout of like several $1,000,000 from a certain committee to fund something else. So the moves of money at the council level do tend to feel marginal because they are. That doesn't mean that they're not like important. So what is the why all of this? Why do we have a budget? Well, you pay taxes to receive services. We collect revenue from a bunch of different sources, and that's how stuff comes out. Quality of those services and not super germane to this. We did an oversight training for that reason. But that's kind of, we collect money, pay for stuff. And in DC, like lots of places, we can't run a deficit. The difference is here, we're not a state, we're not located in a state. And if we run a deficit, a congressional control board takes over. It's bad. So, there's a lot of fear about that happening. Keeping a super sound budget is really, really important for like basic autonomy reasons. So add that to the reasons to be a state pile. So how does this all happen? As we sort of talked about again in our oversight training was very, I talked a lot about committees, what goes into them. There are 13 members on the council, each one oversees, or all but freshman council members chair committees. There's a bunch. These committees are not fixed. They do change. Agencies get moved between them. But the point is that there's a lot of agencies under them. It's a lot of work. And it's worth remembering that each committee oversees like a couple dozen agencies, and that each one of them has their own budget. There are questions to be asked for all of them. So this is a pretty intensive process for a lot of stuff with a lot of moving parts in a really short period of time. And it's hard to keep track of. And that's why advocacy organizations like GGWash tend to focus on particular areas, because there's no way we could possibly do all of this. At a budget hearing, there's public witnesses. I'm signed up to testify on behalf of GGWash at the Office of Planning budget hearing tomorrow. I will say what I'm going to say, and then the council members will usually listen to the government witness testimony and ask them questions. One thing that I think is super common that if you are watching these hearings that you may see is that even if there's a problem, that a council member has identified a problem, it's there though, again, this goes back to the branch of government thing, is that, you have the council member representing the council, and if they're questioning a government witness, the government witness is from the administration. And so there is a sort of generally accepted standard there of, the government witness not saying like, oh, our budget is terrible, I got totally screwed over, like, please help me. Like, that's not, even if that were totally true, that's not a thing that anyone would expect that person to say. That's just not the convention. So, if you are hearing a lot of like, oh, the mayor's budget is suitable, that's kind of where that sentiment comes from. It's easy to pick apart, but it's also pretty, like, it's a standard convention kind of thing. So I bring that up just to, I know sometimes things can get, as you're paying attention to what is going on, if you're watching hearings, if you're reading the news, like it can look like the administration is like stonewalling stuff and saying like, no, the budget is perfect, which is problematic, but is also normal. So, just something to keep in mind there. But otherwise, it's like a pretty standard hearing. And, we talked a lot about pre-hearing questions. Agencies are required to respond to those. If a committee has sent them, I'll reiterate the instructions for finding those again in our follow-up, just if that's of interest. So cool, I told you all this stuff about the budget. Let's talk about where to look for budget stuff. So first of all, there are tons of resources in the budget that are put together by true professionals. And while I count myself a true professional, like I said, the budget is not the thing that I spend the majority of my time on. Lots of people do this all the time, including the district government. And there are some really great existing public resources. You know, if you read one thing, if you're that interested in this, you should read the mayor's executive summary. It does have the rough, you know, sort of dollar amounts. And you can get a pretty good understanding of what they put in their budget. It is, of course, written from the perspective of the administration, so it may gloss over some stuff and you might want to read things in more detail, but it's definitely not a bad place to start. All the budget documents have a how to read section. You should look at it. I try to refresh myself every year because there's obviously stuff that I forget. The DC Council Budget Office has a really great website with some good explainers and tools on it. Also is a very fun budget lookup tool. And I was late putting this slide deck together because I was playing with it. So it is fun to go down rabbit holes with. DC Fiscal Policy Institute advocates around the budget. That's kind of the core of so much of the work that they do. They have really extensive explainers on their website. They are linked here. You can look them up. Highly recommend reading them. It will take some time, but it's worth it. And you know, those are available. They've been doing them for the past couple of years. I think the last two are pretty great. I always suggest this, you know, watch a hearing to get a sense of how council members talk about the budget and how government witnesses explain their agency's work, you know, more so than anything else. It may not, like, you might not get all the answers that you're looking for, but it's a good way to see what the process looks like. Again, I know a number of you on this call, and I know you've watched a hearing before, but I don't know, you can never watch too many hearings. They just, like, they go forever. There's so many. So, okay, great. Now that I told you to look at a bunch of stuff that is not something that I put together, let's look at the actual budget. So I'll take you here. You can go to cfo.dc.gov. Can also just like Google DC FY23 budget until you land on something like that is also totally fine. I do not typically access this from the CFO's page, but here you are, you're on the website. Easiest way to do this is to go to this, let's see, is this by agency? Is by agency usually, and then go to like by agency cluster. But sometimes things are not perfect. And when I was testing this earlier, the example that I wanted to use for tonight was Office of Planning, because it's a smaller agency with a smaller budget. It's a little bit easier to talk through. I clicked on it, took me to the DHCD page. That's wrong. So there are mistakes. Everyone is human. So when you're like, oh no, I can't find my agency by cluster, the easiest way to go back to this is to go into the individual budget chapters. That's broken into 3 parts because these PDFs are huge. How do you know which one to look for? Well, go back to the agency cluster list, eyeball it, be like, well, I guess OP might be in the first one. Click on it, wait for it to load, and then Control F for what you're looking for once you get there. So since all modern government would cease to function without the Control F feature. So that's the long way to do it. You know, in generally those agency cluster pages work, and you just, you know, click around until you find your agency. So I'm looking for Office of Planning. This was already saved, so I don't have to Control F. And this is kind of like, this is the page of an agency that you're looking for when you're looking at the budget. I like to start actually at the bottom because there's charts, there's numbers. Wow, this is so much information and the font's really tiny. Yep, that's a lot of stuff. Here, if you're looking at the mayor's proposed budget, this is typically written sort of like by the agency, obviously reviewed by the, you know, mayor's budget office. But this is just like in words instead of in a chart, like about what you're looking for, which is I find a helpful place to start so that you can actually read the narrative. So if I'm looking at this, you know, there's some increases, but they're not really like, that's not like the increase, or not like a huge increase. This is just to bring things within step. It's not really adding anything. Get to that in a minute. There's a decrease, and then there's an enhancement. So there's a little bit of a difference here where increase and decrease is kind of like a just more technical adjustment. Like there's no more funding for this particular thing, so we're just adjusting the number downward or we needed to increase stuff based on projected fixed cost estimate for fleet, so we adjusted it upward. So those are increases and decreases. Enhancements are like things that are actually new. So if you're looking for new funding or like new programmatic stuff, that's what's going on here. So, you know, you can see this increase and see where it's coming from, or read about that, read about the dollar amounts attached to it, you know, and what that's going to do, right? This budget, I will say broadly, the ARPA funds make reading this a little bit confusing, and we'll get to that in a minute. But when you're seeing sort of like some of this stuff is coming from like ARPA funding, and that's replacing local revenue. I look at this part first. Words, I find them less stressful than numbers. So that is my recommendation, is to start down there. Give that a read, wrap your head around it. Once you're comfortable with that to some extent, you know, I think this table, if you scroll up, this like by revenue type table is like, it's kind of like the table summary of that written summary that you just read. So you can see these increases and enhancements, check out what is one time, what is recurring, that kind of stuff. So I don't have any like particular wisdom on this, right? Like I've been like testifying on OP's budget for several years at this point. So it's like, I am pretty comfortable with what I'm looking at. You don't have to like be totally fine with all of this. And this may be like totally new for you, and that's fine. Read it to the best of your ability and see what you learn is kind of my suggestion there. So like I said, I like that bottom up methodology because you get to start with the narrative, which I find helpful, and then kind of work your way up into a greater level of specification. So I make this joke a lot. And the quote, I pulled the actual quote because I say this about myself, which is that I am legally not allowed to read numbers. This is a very hilarious quote from the article about the Bucatini shortage in the US in 2020, at the end of the pandemic, completely unrelated to anything about this. I hope you can enjoy this and find it funny. But so I hate numbers. I'm really bad at them. I have liberal arts degrees. I joke about this to be self-deprecating. I really, really struggle with this stuff. And I'm not going to tell you that like I somehow mastered this like by any stretch, but instead of trying to fixate on like the actual numbers, since I know that my brain doesn't work that way, I try to start with reading things, right? I read as much as I can and just read it instead of trying to calculate stuff or do math. And then I think the biggest thing that has helped me, especially with looking at public budgets, is trying to understand the relative value of things, because that's ultimately what you're looking at. So if you go to the sort of top line for any agency's budget, scroll up, you know, there's an operating budget, there's your full-time equivalents, we'll talk about those in a second, and the capital budget. And, you know, what you're looking at is kind of this like, this percentage change, like that's a relativity sort of thing, right? So you can look at these numbers and honestly, like to me, like 13, 11, and 17, don't mean that much, right? Like that's not how my brain works. I am not calculating the differentials between those like at all. But looking at them in a sequence and then saying that, okay, the percent change in the operating budget for OP is negative 2.2. So there's 2.2% less planning happening in the District of Columbia with this. Instead of saying like, ooh, that's like negative 2.2, to me, that indicates like I need to read further and figure out what's going on, because it's a negative, which is like, maybe that's not great, maybe it's okay. And I should learn more about that. So I take that as more of a cue than trying to look at the number and trying to make a ton of sense out of the number, if that makes sense. Just you know, I know not everybody is super comfortable with numbers. I am certainly not. And like, I do stress out a little bit that I'm getting some of these wrong. But yeah, I mean, reading this stuff is really helpful. That's my hopefully motivational speech. So, you know, as you're looking for stuff, I just talked about this, you know, there's an increase, there's a decrease, those are more technical adjustments. An enhancement, there's more stuff that's funded than was funded before in the case of OP, some more open street stuff is funded. Good news for us. We've supported open streets. That's super cool. We love it. There's also some more planning going on and funded on New York Avenue. It's supposed to produce more housing units. Again, great. We love it. Love to see it. That's what we sort of are interested in. OP doesn't have any reductions. That's the fourth term on this, which is, less stuff is funded than was funded before. Like that's a cut that will have implications on either a program or employees. Eliminate zeros out or ends a program. The stuff that I'm looking at, which is mostly Office of Planning and DDOT, District Department of Transportation. I haven't found a lot of zeros out yet, but admittedly, I have not spent as much time with DDOT's budget as I have wanted to. So, the big thing, and I talk about this a lot, is that like capital dollars and operating dollars are not the same thing. When you look at this, there's an operating budget and there's a capital budget. I also chose OP because OP has no capital budget for the purposes of this example. So you can see that. So this is an agency that is like just has operating costs, right? They plan. So they hire people, they're paying for their labor to do planning. So that is a really important distinction. If you look at DDOT's budget, which I'm not going to go back and do all of that, but the capital dollars are like way higher because it's a really capital intensive agency. So we have similarly like DGS, Department of General Services, a lot of capital because it's buildings, right? And that's different from agencies like OP. They're smaller and they're mostly funding staff. So I did do that intentionally so that you could see that. I wanted you to see a zero amount next to an agency that is very much doing things to sort of illustrate my point here, which is that capital and operating dollars are not the same. You often cannot cross them. And it's really, really important to remember this. The easiest example, I use this a lot, bus drivers are paid with operating dollars. You pay a person with operating dollars to operate a vehicle, but that bus is paid for with capital dollars. So from two different places, and you don't cross them. So example, I guess if you want to think about this is like, pick up a government building. I don't know, this is a pencil case, you shake it and the pencils all fall out. So here's your capital and here's your operating, right? These are a bunch of little pens. You can think of it that way. There are, of course, some like, you have to spend over a certain amount for something to be capital. Is over 100K here, I think. And basically anything that is acquiring or improving a government owned asset is capital dollars. It's personnel. That's a full-time equivalent, which I'll get to in a minute. I know I keep saying that, but like you can't shift between the two. And I think this is the thing that if I want to get this across to anything, is that like, people don't take you seriously. It's like hard to have this conversation like with an elected official or to communicate this. Like if you say, oh, we're paving so much money on streets and we should pave less because terrible streets like slow down cars and like I hate cars or whatever, just as an example. And it would be so much better if we give people, just a universal basic income. We should set up a UBI program. Paving streets is capital. UBI program is operating, and you can't really change the two. So if you were to show up and advocate for that, wouldn't make much sense. No council member is really going to take that seriously. So if you're trying to advocate for stuff either personally for an organization that you're representing, or just trying to like understand what's going on, if you're having a conversation with friends about like, man, I'm so frustrated that like the city is just like not supporting this thing. Like I wish they cared about it. It's very likely possible that they don't care about it. It's also very likely possible that like you just can't zero out funding for something and move it over to something else. So, be wary of that, like check out what you can, like read what you can, and try to understand the difference between the two, because it's just not all money is swappable. I did have like a really tortured metaphor about how operating dollars are like Bitcoin, capital dollars are like actual cash, and like changing between the two is like not something that you would normally do. They're different kinds of money. You use them to pay for different things, and they're not going to cross too often. Normal example is more like a mortgage is more like a capital expense. It's financed. Mortgage is financed. Rent is more like an operating expense. Like you pay it, you pay cash, pay the rent. There's also something called pay-as-you-go capital, which is it's a capital asset, but it's like already paid for, which is kind of like paying for something in cash. So it's identified as capital asset because it's not operating, but you know. So that is my spiel. I think that's one of the biggest things that I see sort of misunderstood with the budget, especially in like a common discourse. I don't think you should be getting all your budget news from Twitter, but sometimes a lot of the stress around like why was this thing funded and this thing wasn't, why can't we just take money from this and put it into this, is like, has totally legitimate foundation. And sometimes it's just like, those are just not the same money and nothing is going to switch that. I brought up full-time equivalents. I think this is kind of a hard thing for people to understand, but it's obviously really prevalent in the budget. FTEs for full-time equivalent, not for employee. So, you've all probably experienced this in your own jobs if you do budgeting at work or whatever, as you're setting your schedules, like more than one person can do like 40 hours worth of work, right? That might be two part-time positions at 20 hours a week, like whatever, that can be split up in a couple of different ways. Couple of different ways to think about that. But that I bring that up just because like that's a huge chunk of like, what is actually happening here. Like that's, for agencies, especially like OP, and I'm using OP as an example again, is that like OP is doing, like they're doing planning, right? Like they are out in the world, their planners are talking to people, making maps, like planning events, doing outreach. So the way that budget works is really like, this money is for like analysis and like the actual work of planning, and this is like the people who do it. So in this case, OP had this negative 2.2 change, but they have more FTEs, which in some ways like is probably fine. That change as you go in here and are sort of looking for what that change is. Like, this is what I mean about ARPA funding being really confusing, because there's federal money in here. I'm trying to figure out what I was actually looking at to show you. So there are like some changes that look negative. Where is it? But what we're actually getting is like more people to do some more work, and ARPA funding is basically swapping out like some of the local dollars that were used for this, which is not a bad thing, all things considered. And that means that we have 3.8 more FTEs working on planning. So that is my spiel. That is my biggest spiel. And sometimes when you're looking at things as you want to see, some of the answers to that are just like, it's not like a brand new program. It's like another person to work on stuff. That's been kind of the experience that we've had at GGWash in the past in advocating for things, especially for DDOT, where one of our asks is always like, okay, like we need more FTEs, like we need more people to do this. Like here's about a dollar amount that we can attach to that. And that DDOT's actually in a really good place with federal funding this year. So, and was in the previous years as well. So like that's actually really interesting, and I felt like I focused a little bit more on oversight because of that. So I'm almost done, only 5 minutes over my target time. Are you testifying? Like I said, this isn't necessarily about testifying. To explain that, like the ARPA funding is really helpful for the things that we work on, right? A lot of that went to fund transportation. We, like my coworkers and I, need to get our respective policies out the door. And also, if you recall sort of earlier in this conversation, organizing around budget asks works really well at a couple of distinct points in the process. To the administration as early as October, when they're formulating the mayor's budget, and then to the council, like basically like yesterday, like this is like, whatever time you're at, like you should probably done it 3 days ago. That's totally fine. I feel pretty confident about the budgets for the agencies that like I testify on and pay attention to. In the event that we ever did have a big budget ask, coalitions are particularly helpful in this regard. Council offices do really like seeing a number of groups sign on to things, like because it makes their lives easier. They can presuppose some support from a large population of people with that, and makes it easier for them to argue, to other offices, to whatever, to secure funding for that. So that's just something to like think about if you're ever doing your own organizing. It's really like both the earlier the better, with like frequent reminders, because this is so intensive. If you are contacting council offices about this in like November, December, January, like be sure that you're following up with them in like February, March, and April to both be supportive and share your ask. If you're testifying, as an individual, I think it's more than enough to just submit your testimony during the timeline. So happy to talk a little bit more about timing for this stuff. But we're, like I said, we're not organizing around particular asks in the future. You may get an email from me that says like, we need you to sign this letter in support and send in testimony and show up and, make a big budget ask for X, Y, and Z. But that's not really something that we need to do right now. So it's a good place to be, but that doesn't mean that this will go without scrutiny. So in part because we're not organizing, I was able to give a training about how this stuff works instead of just about, why we would be making a certain ask. So, we'll circulate the oversight testimony, which did have some testimony trainings and tips. And that's about it from me. I've talked a lot, so thank you. Yeah, let me know if you need anything. I'm trying to widen my Zoom panel so I can see everyone. Cool. Any questions? Jay, go ahead.
So I know you said you didn't really like to look at the numbers, but if somebody wanted to, is there a good source for finding out if, say, a program's funding number is enough? Like in that OP section that you showed, I saw something about there being like 75K for Deanwood small area plans. But like, I have no idea if that's a good amount, if that's a lot, if that's, a small number that, somebody would want to see increased. Like, if I see a particular program is getting some amount of funding, like how do I know if that is in any way reasonable or something that I should look into further?
Yeah, good question. And that is actually like, it's funny, it's like that's less about like the specific number and more about like what is this thing, what does it cost, what is the value that we're ascribing to it. So small area plans, and like I guess like to answer your question, part of this is to ask someone, part of my job is knowing how much a small area plan costs, which can range from 50 to 150K is typically the average kind of thing. Sometimes they can be more, sometimes they can be less. One thing that I can also tell you, because more funding for small area planning has been something that GGWash has asked for the past like 5 or 6 years, is that typically if this is contracted out, it costs OP a little bit more money. I think they've brought down some of the cost of the small area plans by hiring more people, so that they're doing a lot of the planning in-house rather than contracting it out to a consultant. So that's made it cost a little bit less money to conduct small area planning. So 75K for Deanwood is, I think, somewhat appropriate. I want to say that OP, I would have to check previous budgets, because I think there was like 125 spent on the Chevy Chase small area plan. On one hand, I have a knee-jerk reaction to like, that's a disparity. We're only spending 75 in the Deanwood small area plan. They spent 125 on the Chevy Chase small area plan. But, to be a little bit self-reflexive with that, one of the arguments for spending more money on planning in Ward 3 was to get more housing built there eventually, because so very little has been. And so, if that requires more planning, like that may be a reasonable trade-off. But the answer to your question, I think is you can both look in previous budgets, right, which is like a lot of legwork, and I totally understand if you don't want to do that to try to get a sort of perspective on it. You can also ask somebody who works on this, right? Like you just asked me, which I appreciate. I hope I was able to give a sufficient answer. Worst case scenario, you can email the agency. Not worst case scenario, but like you can reach out to the agency and say like, hey, I have a question. Like, how much did you spend on this stuff previously? Is this like the normal amount for a small area plan? They might not love the question because it might be coming to them at a busy time, but they should answer you. And otherwise, I think like this is, I like to think that this is where advocates like me can be particularly helpful, and that, certainly there are other interest groups in the city who are working on this and reviewing the budget, who can give you a sense of, especially under their topic areas, why something is what it is. But yeah, you're right. It's not easy. And like, it's not easy to see, like, I struggle with this, like sometimes with DDOT too, is like, is this the amount of money that they need? Is this too much? Is this too little? And it's just something that like, I don't have a perfect answer to, but it's something that I am trying to learn over time as I pay more attention to things. Oh, and also that also made me think is that so studies, right? Studies are something that like also get funded a lot, and it's like have some variety in them. But my understanding is that studies are typically like 100 to 250 is about like the amount of money for a study that is typically spent. Sometimes a little bit more if they are more comprehensive or require more consultants. But since you see that a lot with transportation and planning, a study could be 150, a study could be up to 250, and it kind of depends on just like what the topic is. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess less concerned about that specific example, is just trying to use it as a number that I saw in the thing that you were showing on the screen. I guess for my own actual example, like last year I was trying to ask for, looking at the DPW budget and trying to ask for more of the parking enforcement to be, shifted from residential permit enforcement to things like, parking and bike lanes and parking and crosswalks and that sort of thing. And I couldn't even find any numbers on that, but like.
Yeah, so that is kind of, let me see if I can, this might take me a little bit to find, so I'm going to kind of chatter while I look it up, and this may be something that I follow up with you offline about because it's kind of complicated. So with the enforcement, like I think that is done through FTEs and not necessarily through like a program, right? It's like you're like somebody's hired to carry out that action. So that may have been why you didn't see a number for like a specific line item program. The interesting thing about, not interesting, this is actually really bad, like DPW has a bajillion vacancies right now. So, and that's in their pre-hearing questions for oversight, is like there's like a third of the positions are vacant. So the strategy here, like if you're thinking about submitting testimony on this, I think is to say like, and this is a little bit of a complex argument to make, is more that you would like, without knowing, like it's okay, you're a resident, it's okay to say that like without knowing how much like it would actually cost to get the thing that you want to see, a place that you could potentially find funding for it is this place, and shift the conversation to what would you reallocate money for the thing that you want to see. Council offices like that a lot. I try to use that in my own language if I'm asking for more money for something, is to say like where it should come from. Part of that might be to say that like, to acknowledge that DPW is like really low on staff right now, but that like it's really essential that they be reallocated to one particular task. Like that is an argument that you could make. And then it makes it like, then you're like out of the like, how much money should we even be spending on this? Because honestly, like who knows how much money we should be spending on this? And I don't say that to be flip. We have a really big budget. I mean, we're at like a $19 billion budget. That's a really like, we can't even look to other cities like at this point. Like we could maybe look at New York's budget and see how much they spend, but it would be different because the way that they contract stuff out is different, especially with public works. So it's like, yeah, it's hard to find an analogy, and it's okay not to know the precise number. In that case, like you can admit that you don't, and offer suggestions of where funding for that might be coming from, especially if what you're looking for is more people to perform the task, which is at the root of the DPW work that we're talking about. Cool. I got a thumbs up. Thank you, Jay. Mark, go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, totally. First off, thanks. This is super interesting, and I'm just into my foray of figuring out how to interact with the government. So I appreciate this super informative presentation. So I have like a specific scenario that I want to work towards, and maybe I could just lay that out, and I want to kind of get your thoughts of how that interacts with the budgeting process. So I live in Ward 1. They're building a new protected bike lane on Kenyon Street here. And they're building it up to 11th Street, which is awesome. But in DC's broader plans, they want to extend it. From my understanding, it's not been budgeted to be extended all the way to 14th Street. And so I'm curious, you kind of laid out a bunch of different touch points in the whole budgeting process. How would someone go, assuming there is support in the community for this, what are kind of the most high leverage touch points in this process to push for funding to be allocated? Specifically, also thinking about how this is just being built in Ward 1. It's not like a citywide thing as some other budgeting things would be. So would this be something that needs to be pushed for in the budgeting process? Is this something I should be really just pushing my local Ward 1 council member for? Kind of how should I be thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So congrats, you've identified a capital project, first of all. So, with this, there's a couple of different things that you can do, and I'm going to go from like very broad to very specific. I think you're totally on the right track. I sense that you are paying attention to some of the things in this space. Also, like, I live in Parkview, so so I am familiar with this project. And I know the ANC is as well, and are generally supportive of moving this along. So that's actually something where you can sort of say, hey, cool, like my ANC has been supportive of this work, like the Transportation Committee is doing good work, like this is really awesome. And I put a pin in GGWash trains and recruits and endorses ANC commissioners for this reason. So you are starting from a good place with that, which is great. You can, certainly engage in this kind of stuff in the oversight process. Like if you want to, we're out of oversight now, just kind of flagging it for next year is to say, like, this is something that I'm interested in. I don't think you need to like show up to the hearing for that, but it's a good thing to communicate to the T&E committee and also to your council member. As I know your council member's office has been really active on this. So worth reaching out to them for sure, to say like, hey, I'm really interested in this. Do you have any strategic direction for me? But the actual technical thing that I think would happen and that you can ask for is a subtitle in the BSA. So if you remember sort of at the beginning of this presentation, like that there can be like, basically, they can say that, oh, there's capital funding in DDOT's budget, but also like the Ward 1 office can start looking around and judging stuff around, like that you can then sort of say either to, Councilmember Nadeau's office, to ANC 1A, or submit it to the TNE record. And I'm happy to follow up with you in writing. So it's a little bit easier to talk about that. That what you're looking for is a BSA subtitle that acknowledges the like extension of like that route. And will it work? I don't know, but like that's kind of what would, like, if somebody like were trying to actually execute that like through the budget, it would be done through a BSA subtitle. So that's kind of what you're looking for as the mechanism in the budget. And you obviously have some existing institutions that are supportive of that and on their way. So I definitely recommend, reaching out, especially to the council member's office, but submitting testimony. I don't think you need to give it in person. I think it would be cool for the T&E committee to hear something like this though. And just a like really brief note, basically what you told me and saying that that's what you're looking for, I think would go a long way.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Oh yeah, I guess, yes, for everyone else in the chat, Jay's comment, yeah, we love the crosstown cycle track over here, and it could be more extensive, and one way to do that is to like say that you want more. And just hearing from people who are supportive of like more spending on this stuff can often be really helpful and can set these projects up for success down the line when they are in the sort of planning and implementation phase. It has not been as bad as I've thought recently, but then, there can be neighborhood pushback for this. And I think it's helpful for people to know that some of these requests did originate from residents who were looking at their neighborhood and saying that they wanted to see something. So, cool. Anything else I can answer?
Hey, Alex, this is great. Thanks for explaining what full-time equivalent means. I actually jotted that down and was like, I do not know what this means, but I noticed a decrease. Yeah, since you're doing open office hours, I guess I will ask you a specific numbers question. So I'm helping put together a testimony, and I ultimately did not include this in my part of the testimony as an actual problem, but I did put like a little comment like, I noticed this, I don't know if it's significant. So anyway, I noticed a decrease of about $4.5 million in the planning and sustainability division, which includes bike and pedestrian infrastructure. And so I don't know if like that worries you. But then I also noticed, I think there was an increase in the funding, but I noticed a 4.0 or a decrease in full-time equivalent for the transit delivery division, which includes the streetcar and the circulator. So I don't know if that like is also alarming.
Yeah, so good question. Like, I think some of this might, like, there's a couple of things that are happening here, which is that some of this may also be like ARPA fund weirdness. But also you are looking at like FTEs. Take a look at the capital projects, because there are, I think I did like a really cursory look at data. I have not followed my own advice and read it. That's a bit still is that there are some pretty big gains for the actual like projects. So PSD, as you figured out, builds bike lanes, builds like infrastructure, that kind of stuff. I believe there's some increases in like those kinds of projects, like in the capital. And then for the streetcar, I think there is either stable or slightly increased capital funding. So that's something where I'm not super concerned about swings on like the personnel side, especially because DDOT is like such a huge agency. I would be concerned if I also saw a drop for like the capital items as well. And there may be some, because that is like, it was hard for me to read an OP's budget also, was that like the ARPA funds were replacing local funds. So it looked like a decrease because the ARPA funds need to have a separate line. So that may also be something in there. So I'm not super stressed about it. DDOT has done pretty well with the federal recovering dollars, which is great. And I think the thing to check there is just making sure that like the capital projects are moving along. There may also be some changes in like the years in which things are being built. Like that's a little bit more complex, and if I see anything, I'll let you know. But making sure that those are tied together is, I think, the biggest thing.
Cool. Okay, that all makes sense, and it sounds like that all squares then. Yeah, on the capital side, I think the streetcar stuff was stable. Somebody else is actually doing all of like the infrastructure safety type stuff for pedestrian bicycle, but like I noticed it, so I jotted that decrease down. But cool, thanks.
Cool, you are welcome. Anything else I can help with? If not, then I'm all good. I'm happy to hang out here until 7:15 if anybody thinks of anything. But otherwise, wait, Marvin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Just thinking about capital projects. And maybe I missed it. I apologize. Earlier, is the best time to advocate for capital projects that are currently not in this upcoming budget to really try and push for them this like upcoming fall, when the mayor is sort of like starting to put together her budget and thinking about the next year?
I think, like, honestly, it's never too early to start talking about it. So if you want to like submit something like this year that's like, hey, I want to see this, like definitely get it started, like start talking about it. I do this a lot where just like I try not to rest too much on it, but like obviously we all have like unformed ideas, right? Sometimes like I will like kind of put something in to be like, in my testimony that's like, I'm not totally sure what I'm asking for here exactly, but I think we should do this. The other thing is that like the capital improvement plan goes out 6 years. So like, it's not impossible like for somebody like someone could, a council office like could stick money that there's like, it would be hard, but it's possible to say like, okay, well, we could fund this thing for, 2027. That is possible, given the length of the CIP that it goes out. So it's doable. But I do think like, early and often, because like that cements ideas into people's minds, and also I think tees you up then to have something to organize around. Like when you do get around to like that time where it is like, you want to get organizations to sign on, you do want to start contacting the departments and say like, we would love to see this in the budget. We'd really love to see this in the budget. And if we don't see it in the budget, we're going to make a big deal of it at council or whatever. And that'll all take like a couple of years, which I know you're familiar with, but yeah, say it. Like, again, even if it's in writing, if you're not able to testify at the hearing, to just say like, I am interested in this, I would like to see it, send it to the committee and your council member, and just keep it simmering. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
And thank you for putting this together.
You're welcome. Thanks for everybody for listening. We talked about the budget for 40 minutes. Cool. Well, I will put my email address in the chat. I think everybody has it. Like I said, we'll send a follow-up email. If anyone has any written questions, like feel free to reach out to me if you need help with anything. Let me know. And yeah, glad to see you all. I really appreciate you being here. And yeah, let me know if you need anything. Stay in touch. And I don't know like what we'll do next. Like when I was finishing the oversight training, I was like, we're gonna do a budget training in March. Like stay tuned for the date. But I can pitch our spring gala at the end of April. Chelsea, what's the date?
April 28th at Mess Hall in Northeast DC.
And we'll do some, I'm sure I'll come up with something like weird to do in the meantime. We are doing a couple of candidate forums. We're doing something in Ward 3 on April 4th, and I'm trying to line something up for at-large candidates on April 19th. So stay tuned for that. If you get our emails, all the information will be there. And yeah, it's kind of the GGWash updates. It's fun to be able to give updates. So thank you so much, and let me know what you need, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Alex.
Thank you.